The king had already decided it was her fault. The baby had been crying for 2 days without stopping. The physicians had failed. The ladies were exhausted, and when she was brought in at dawn, escorted by guards as though she were guilty of something, he did not even greet her. "Take him," she obeyed, and the moment the boy touched her chest, the crying stopped. The room fell silent. The king did not. Why did the king's son calm only in the arms of the woman he despised? The king's face did something complicated, relief and bitterness moving through it in the same instant. "You will remain here," he said. "You will not leave this nursery without permission. You will not speak to members of the court. You will not look at me directly." He paused. "You are here because you are needed. Nothing more." Marin kept her eyes on the child. "Yes, Your Majesty," she said. He left without another word. She stood in the middle of the nursery, which was grand and cold and smelled of beeswax candles, and the particular anxiety of people who have been failing at something, and looked down at the infant quieting against her shoulder, and understood her situation completely. She was a widow from Ashvale. 3 weeks ago she had buried a daughter who had lived 2 days. She had no money, no family willing to take her in, and no future she could currently identify. She had been brought here not because anyone cared what happened to her, but because her body had something this castle needed. The king had not asked her name. She pressed her lips to the top of the baby's head and told herself, "This is enough. It has to be it." And she began to sing, the song about the river and the reeds, the one her mother had sung to her, and the child's small fist found her finger in the dark and held on. His name, she learned 9 days later, was Aldric. Not from anyone who was supposed to tell her. No one was supposed to tell her anything, but from Sybil, a young lady in waiting, who had not yet learned the court's discipline of silence, and whispered it like a gift in the corridor one morning, quick and bright-eyed before disappearing around a corner. "Aldric," Marin said softly, looking down at the face she had memorized by then, the furrow between his brows when he was hungry, the way he tracked light across the ceiling with an expression of pure scientific interest. "Your name is Aldric." He grabbed her finger. She smiled despite herself. The king came to the nursery exactly once in those first weeks. He stood in the doorway, looked at the child in her arms with an expression she was not supposed to see, and said to the steward behind him, "Is she adequate?" The steward looked at her, as though assessing livestock. "The child thrives, Your Majesty." "Good." The king turned to leave, then paused. Without looking at her, "She is not to be consulted on any matter of the child's care beyond feeding. That is Lord Brennan's jurisdiction." He left. Marin stood very still until the sound of his footsteps faded. Lord Brennan. She had seen him twice in the corridors, a man of perhaps 55, with the smooth, unhurried certainty of someone who has operated without opposition for so long that opposition no longer occurs to him as a possibility. He had looked at her both times with the mild, impersonal assessment of a man verifying that a piece of equipment is in its correct location. She thought nothing of it then. She was too tired for thinking. She walked Aldric through the small hours, sang to him, slept in fragments when she could, and told herself that surviving was enough for now. She found out the truth on a Tuesday afternoon, by accident, in the lower storerooms. She had gone to fetch linen, the usual girl was ill, a small detail that would later seem like the kind of coincidence that is not a coincidence at all. The storerooms were cool and quiet, lit by a single torch near the entrance, the shelves stacked high with folded cloth, and the organized supplies of a large household. She was reaching for the upper shelf when she heard voices from the adjacent chamber. She would have walked away. She was not the kind of woman who listened at walls, but she heard her own title first, the nurse, and then 2 words that stopped her breathing entirely, the child. She stood motionless. Lord Brennan's voice was the one she recognized, low and unhurried as always, explaining something to the other man the way a patient teacher explains arithmetic to a slow student. The second voice, she did not know, but she understood what she heard. A compound of herbs, introduced in small doses into the enriched grain gruel that would be prepared when the weaning process began, gradual, accumulating over weeks, producing a slow failure to thrive that would be indistinguishable, in a child born under difficult circumstances, from natural weakness. She heard the name Lord Ranulph. She heard the phrase, "if the heir does not survive to his 2nd birthday." She heard herself stop breathing, and then remember to start again. She left without the linen. She walked back through the castle with Aldric's face in her mind, and her hands locked into fists at her sides, and the cold, absolute clarity of a woman who understands that she is the only person standing between this child and the men who want him dead, and that no one in this building is going to believe her. That night, sitting beside the cradle in the dark with her heart hammering so loudly she was half convinced it would wake him, she turned the problem over from every angle. The steward reported to Brennan. The ladies-in-waiting were part of a court structure Brennan had largely built over 12 years. She had no name, no position, no power of any kind. She was a wet nurse from Ashvale. If she went to anyone in this castle with what she had heard, the most likely outcome was that Lord Brennan would be told, and then she would be gone by morning. She was also the only person who knew. She picked up Aldric, who stirred but did not wake, and held him against her chest and felt the furious, improbable certainty of his heartbeat, this small life that had come into the world in catastrophe and clung to it anyway, and she made her decision. When the kitchen sent up the first portion of the enriched weaning gruel 3 days later, 2 months ahead of what any physician would have recommended, which she understood now had been designed precisely for that purpose, she set the bowl aside. She sent back a message in the careful, neutral language she had been practicing in her head. The child was showing signs of digestive sensitivity. She advised continuing the established feeding schedule. The weaning should wait. The kitchen sent back Lord Brennan's instruction. She sent back her assessment. The kitchen sent back a firmer instruction, this time with a note that the schedule had been personally authorized by Lord Brennan. She sent back, Lord Brennan was not a physician, and she would not risk the health of the prince on a schedule that contradicted her direct observation of his constitution. She signed it with her name and her title, and set down the pen with hands that were not entirely steady. For 2 days nothing happened, 2 days in which she barely slept at all, in which she checked every piece of food that arrived in the nursery with the focused, methodical attention of a woman who knows that the danger is real and that no one is coming to help her. She watched the door, she watched the corridor. Once, near midnight, she was almost certain she heard footsteps pause outside the nursery and then move on, and she sat with her back against the wall and Aldric in her arms until the morning light came through the window. On the 3rd day she was summoned, not to Lord Brennan's offices, to the king's study. She stood outside the heavy oak door and understood that this could go in 2 directions, and that she could control only one of them, herself, and that the way she said what she had to say would matter as much as what she said. She straightened her plain dress. She went in. Aldric was at the window. He did not look up immediately. "You have been refusing Lord Brennan's instructions," he said. "I have, Your Majesty. He is considering having you removed from your position." The words were a blade laid flat on the table between them, not threatening yet but visible. She kept her voice level. "I understand. I would ask, before that decision is made, to tell you what I know." A pause. "There is something you need to hear. I am aware you have no particular reason to believe me. I am going to tell you anyway." He turned then, the full force of his attention, which was considerable when he chose to give it. His eyes moved over her face in the assessing way she had come to know, but underneath it, something she had not seen from him before. He was listening. She told him everything. She did it without embellishment, without the desperate edge of someone pleading, because she had decided that this moment required clarity above all else, and that she would give him the facts and let him judge them. She told him what she had heard in the storeroom, the names, the method, the motive. She told him she had no proof beyond what her own ears had given her. She told him she understood the difference between her word and Lord Brennan's. When she finished, the room was very quiet. She could hear her own heartbeat. "Leave me," he said. She left. The hours that followed were the longest she could remember. She went back to the nursery and cleaned it with the methodical intensity of a woman who needs her hands to be doing something. She checked Aldric's food again. She sat in the chair by the window and watched the courtyard below, and told herself that whatever happened, she had said what needed to be said, that she could not have done otherwise, that if he chose not to believe her, and she was sent away by nightfall, she would have the cold comfort of having tried. Aldric woke from his nap and looked up at her with his father's serious eyes, and reached both arms toward her, and she picked him up and held him against her shoulder and thought, "I fought for you. Whatever comes next, you will never know it, but I fought for you." She was not dismissed that evening or the next morning. On the 2nd day, she heard, again through Sybil, reliable as a church bell, that Lord Brennan had been called to a private meeting with the king. On the morning of the 4th day, Lord Brennan was gone. Not to prison, not to the executioner. She was not naive enough to have expected either, but reassigned to a distant administrative post with the kind of quiet, irresistible firmness that is more frightening to powerful men than any public accusation. The announcement said nothing. The castle felt everything. Two of Brennan's associates disappeared from their positions within the week. A new face appeared at the king's side, Lord Croft, quieter than Brennan, with the careful eyes of a man who has decided that honesty is the more durable strategy. The court talked in lowered voices. People looked at her differently in the corridors, some with curiosity, some with the particular hostility of those who understand that something has shifted and are still deciding how to feel about it. She lowered her head and kept walking. She had just put Aldric down for the evening and was sitting in the chair by the window, finally allowing her body to unknot itself from weeks of sustained fear when the nursery door opened. Aldric came in. She rose. He crossed the room without speaking and stopped at the cradle. She stood back and gave him the space because this moment was his, and it was private, and she had learned that he needed privacy the way most people need air. She watched him look at his son. The first time she realized that she had seen him do it without the weight of crisis or performance, without anyone watching, without anything required of him except simply to be a father looking at a child. His face was undone. The control he maintained so perfectly in every other room came apart here, quietly, without drama. Grief and love and something that looked like terrified wonder moving through him in sequence, as though he were feeling all of it for the first time because he had not permitted himself to feel it before. She looked at the window. She gave him that. After a long time, he said, "He has his mother's brow." "I didn't know the Queen," she said. "I can't compare." A silence. Aldric reached down. Edric's fingers found his father's in the sleeping dark, wrapped around them with the same blind, immediate grip that had caught her breath on the very first day. She laughed easily, he said quietly. "The marriage was arranged. I did not choose her, and she did not choose me." But she laughed at things that were genuinely funny, and it turned out that mattered more than either of us knew. She understood he was saying something real, something that lived outside the official record, and she understood also why he could say it to her, because she was no one, because what you say to furniture does not travel through a court. It stung, that understanding, quietly and precisely. "I'm glad she gave you something good," she said. He looked at her. The inventory look had shifted into something that had more weight and more uncertainty to it. "She deserved more years than she was given," he said. "She tried her best with what she had. I did not always make it easy." He paused. "I was told when she died that grief was a private matter, that a king's mourning should be brief and should not be visible." Another pause. "I followed that instruction. I'm not certain it helped anything." "It helps no one," she said very quietly, "in my experience." He looked at her in a way she was not prepared for, the way a person looks when they have not been seen in a long time and have been reminded that it is possible. She dropped her eyes. "Thank you," he said. She understood he meant all of it. The nights, the walking, the song she did not know he had heard, and the thing she had risked in his study. "He is easy to love," she said simply. Something crossed his face. A door opened and then carefully, deliberately, pulled shut again. He looked back at the cradle. "Yes," he said. "I expect he is." He left. She stood at the window for a long time. He came back the following week, and the week after that. Not always to speak with her. Sometimes he came only for Aldric, acknowledged her with a nod, and that was proper, and she held to that propriety with both hands. But sometimes he stayed, and those times the conversation happened the way it had the first night, at an angle careful, each of them using the neutral topics of the child's progress and the harvest reports, and the state of the northern roads as enough cover to say things they meant in tones that revealed more than the words did. She learned that he had been 10 years old when his father died, that he had been handed the idea of the crown before he understood what it meant to be a child, that he had never in his entire adult life made a significant decision that was entirely his own. His advisors, his counsel, his duty, his blood had always decided first, and he had followed because he genuinely believed that was what being a good king meant. He learned that she had married at 23, that her husband Thomas had been a quiet, steady man who fixed things without being asked and made her feel that ordinary life was not a compromise, but a choice. That she had lost him to fever before the first frost, and the child 6 weeks later too early, and had walked into winter with nothing. He listened the way almost no one had ever listened to her, as though her words had weight, as though the things she had lived through mattered in this room, in this castle, in this world where everyone had already decided what she was. She should not have let any of it mean anything. She was precise about this. She maintained every correct distance. She was appropriate in every exchange. She reminded herself, regularly and firmly, of the cartography of the situation, her position, his position, and the centuries of social architecture that stood between those 2 points like a mountain range. But the heart is not a disciplined organ. It catalogues without permission. She found herself noting, despite herself, the way he moved his hand through his hair when something troubled him, the way he looked at Aldric now, fully, without armor. The one time he had laughed at something she said, low and surprised, pulled out of him before he could stop it, and the way catching himself had told her more than the laugh had. She was managing all of this, carefully, when Sybil arrived in the nursery one morning, vibrating with news she had been holding for approximately 20 minutes. Lady Isadora of Velmore, third daughter of the Earl of Velmore, 28, accomplished, well-connected. The family had been pressing the match for 2 years. With the heir past his first birthday, and the political pressure at a level that could no longer be ignored, the council had begun preliminary discussions. Lady Isadora would arrive within the fortnight. Maren thanked Sybil. She waited until she was alone. Then she sat very still in the chair and did the work of accepting what was true and could not be changed. He needed an alliance. The kingdom needed a queen. These things were facts, and they were correct, and they had nothing to do with her. She picked up Aldric, who had been hauling himself to standing against the cradle with the furious determination of a child who has decided the world is moving too slowly, and held him against her chest. "You're going to have a mother," she told him quietly. "A proper one. You will be loved." She pressed her lips to his hair. "You are already very good at being loved." He grabbed her ear and pulled. She laughed briefly, and then felt the laugh settle into something heavier. She did not see the king for the better part of 2 weeks. He was occupied with Isadora's visit, the formal meals, the garden walks, the careful mutual assessment that passed for courtship, when the parties involved had been brought together by strategy rather than feeling. The castle hummed with a particular kind of anticipatory energy. She was returning from the kitchen with Aldric on her hip when she came around the corner near the great hall and found Aldric standing alone in the corridor, looking at the wall. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and the expression on his face in that unguarded moment, before the king's composure settled back into place, was one she had not seen before. He looked like a man standing in a room he does not want to be in, who has just been reminded that other rooms exist. She should have kept walking. "Lady Isadora seems like a good match," she said, because it was the thing that needed to be said, the thing that named the shape of the world correctly, so that neither of them would make the mistake of forgetting it. Something moved across his face. "The council is pleased," he said. "And you?" He did not answer immediately. "She is accomplished," he said at last. "The alliance would be useful. These are real considerations." "They are," she agreed. "You believe I should proceed?" She looked at him directly, which she allowed herself rarely. "I believe you will do what is right for your kingdom," she said. "I believe that is what you have always done." It was the truthful answer and the careful answer simultaneously, and he heard both layers of it. She could see that. He looked at her for one long moment, and then looked away, and she continued down the corridor with Aldric on her hip and the steady weight of someone who has done the correct thing and knows it is going to cost her. Lord Croft came to the nursery 18 days later, in the afternoon, with his hands behind his back and the expression of a man delivering a message that belongs to someone else. Her services were complete. The weaning was fully accomplished. She would be released from her position at Aldenmoor, effective in 3 days, with a generous final payment and a letter of recommendation. Lord Croft delivered this information in the tone of someone reading from a document. She thanked him. He left. She sat down then because she needed to, and she held Aldric. She would not count the days. She refused to do that. It would make every remaining hour into a subtraction, and she pressed her face into his hair and breathed and let herself, in the privacy of this room with no audience, feel the shape of what she was losing. Not just the child, though that loss alone would have been sufficient to break a less experienced heart, but all of it. The months of becoming someone who belonged somewhere. The slow, careful building of something that had no name and no future but had been real, had been deeply and completely real. She set it down. She packed her bag. On her last morning, she dressed Aldric in his warmest clothes and carried him to the window. Overnight, the first snow of the season had fallen, covering the courtyard in white, a hush over everything, the world made temporarily simple and clean. He pressed his palm flat against the cold glass and stared at the snow with the total astonishment of someone encountering a concept for the very first time. She watched his face. She memorized it. She thought, "This is enough. Carry this, and it is enough." She wrote him a letter she knew he could not yet read, left it with Sybil, and explained with a look rather than words what she needed Sybil to do with it. Sybil, to her credit, nodded without being asked twice. She was in the corridor with her bag at her feet, finishing her farewell to Sybil, who was crying, which made things considerably harder, when she heard footsteps coming fast from the direction of the great hall. Fast was not a word that applied to the king. He moved through the castle with the measured weight of a man who understands that kings do not run. But these footsteps were fast, and they belonged to him, and his face when he came around the corner was the face she had seen that first night in the nursery, the control dissolved, the man visible, the armor on the floor. He stopped when he saw her bag. "You're leaving," he said. "My position is complete," she said carefully. "Lord Croft gave you that message on my instruction." His voice had a roughness in it she had not heard before. "I told him to arrange your release. I made that decision 4 days ago." He stopped. "I told myself it was the right thing, that you had completed your service, and that keeping you here any longer that releasing you was fairness." He stopped again. It was not fairness. Sybil had gone so still against the wall she might have been painted there. "What was it?" Maren asked. "It was cowardice," he said, and it cost him something to say it. She could see that. "I sent you away because keeping you here made it impossible to do what I had agreed to do, with Isadora, with the council, with everyone who has spent 12 years deciding what my life looks like." He looked at her directly. "I convinced myself you would be better served by leaving, that you would go home and rebuild and find the life you deserved, and I told myself this was for your sake." The corridor was very quiet. Somewhere below, the sound of the kitchens. Somewhere above, Edric's voice, the small conversational sounds he had recently developed, practicing language, practicing the world. "The preliminary agreement with Lady Isadora's family," he said, "is not yet formal. I spoke with Croft this morning. I have told him it will not proceed." He paused. "The council will not receive this well. Several of the noble families will object. There are those who will see this as evidence that grief has compromised my judgment, and they will say so loudly, and they will use it." Another pause. "There is a real possibility that Lord Ranulph's faction, which we broke but did not destroy, will find in this an opportunity they have been waiting for. I am aware of these risks." She looked at him. "You are describing a significant threat to your stability," she said. "Yes. Over a wet nurse from Ashvale." "Over a woman from Ashvale," he said, "who walked into my study with no power and no protection and told me the truth at the cost of everything she had, who held my son through every dark hour of his first year, who treated him like a person before I was capable of doing it myself." He stopped. "I will not pretend this is uncomplicated. I will not pretend the court will forgive it quickly, or that there won't be months of difficulty. I am telling you the whole truth of it, because you have a right to the whole truth." He looked at her. "I am also telling you that my first marriage was arranged when I was 25 years old, by men who had decided what my life looked like. She was a good woman, and she deserved better than a man who had never chosen her. I will not do that again, not to another woman, and not to myself." He held her gaze. "I am asking you to stay. That is a different thing from anything I have offered you before." Maren stood very still. She thought of the corridor on the morning they brought her here, the cold, the guards, the king who had not asked her name. She thought of the storeroom and the voices, and the 2 days she had spent alone with a secret that could get her killed. She thought of Edric's fist around her finger in the dark. She thought of the river and the reeds and the long way around to where you are supposed to be. "I will stay," she said. What followed was neither simple nor quiet, and she had not expected otherwise. The council met in an emergency session that lasted most of a day. Aldric attended it the way she had seen him attend difficult things, with the complete stillness of a man who has already made his decision and is present only to fulfill the formality of the opposition exhausting itself. Croft managed the room with the precise, patient competence of someone who has chosen his position deliberately and intends to hold it. Lady Isadora's family responded with cold dignity. The lady herself sent a brief, formal letter, composed and without cruelty, which Maren respected enormously and suspected cost more than it appeared. The court talked. She let it. She had not come from a world where what people said about her could destroy her more completely than what she did with her own hands. She went about her work, caring for Edric, learning the landscape of a life she had never been trained for. asking questions plainly when she did not know and refusing to pretend she did. She made no speeches. She offered no performances. She let that be the argument she made. The marriage was held in March, in the chapel at Aldenmoor, with spring light coming through the high windows in long, pale bars that fell across the stone floor like a benediction. Some members of the court attended, some did not, and the ones who did not were making a statement that would require, in the months and years ahead, patient and consistent response. She understood all of this. She went through the ceremony with the same steadiness she had brought to every other moment in this castle that had required something from her. The same steadiness with which she had walked into a king's study with nothing but the truth. When the formal proceedings were finished, and the hall had shifted into the looser rhythms of celebration, Aldric found her near the window where Edric who walked now, who moved through the world with extraordinary confidence and frequent spectacular falls, which seemed to her a reasonable approach to being 15 months old, was conducting a serious investigation of the window seat. "How are you?" he asked. She considered the question honestly. "I am well," she said. Then, because she was finished with careful answers, and he had earned the real one, "I am happy." He looked at her with the eyes she had learned, the storm and the warmth underneath it, the specific quality of a man who has chosen something against considerable resistance and found on the other side of the choosing that it was exactly as real as he had believed it would be. "I am going to teach him to ride in the spring," he said, watching Edric achieve the window seat and turn around with the expression of a man surveying a conquered territory. "He will fall off constantly," she said. "Repeatedly and enthusiastically," he agreed. "He will love every moment." "Yes," Aldric smiled quietly, in the way she had seen him smile only in this room, only with no audience, only when he was not performing anything at all. "He will." Edric turned then, saw both of them watching him, and produced the expression of delighted self-importance he had been perfecting since October. He opened both arms in the direction of Maren, unmistakable, absolute, the gesture of a child who has never once doubted he will be caught. She crossed the room and lifted him, and he wrapped both arms around her neck with the complete and uncomplicated certainty of someone who has always known that this is where he belongs. Aldric put his hand on the boy's back, and then on hers. No ceremony, no audience, just a man placing his hand on the back of the woman he had chosen on a morning in March, with the light coming through the window and the long winter finally over. She was not the same woman who had been escorted to this castle before sunrise with nothing but a shawl and a grief too new to name. He was not the man who had looked at her as though she were a problem to be managed. They had both travelled a route that had been difficult and had not been planned, and had paid prices they had each decided, separately and then together, were worth the paying. It was worth it. She knew this the way she knew the song about the river, not because someone had told her, but because she had followed the water long enough to understand where it was always going to end up. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself thinking of someone who chose you, or someone you had the courage to choose, I would love to know. Leave your rating below, from 0 to 10. Every number tells me whether these stories are reaching the hearts they were made for. And if you know someone who needs to hear that it is never too late to choose differently, send this to them. These stories find the people who need them. They always have.